Hello, everybody. You are welcome to this webinar, which is the July edition of our monthly workshop. It's a great pleasure to have you here on board. This event is hosted by Richflood, a leading continental provider of environmental and social due diligence services for investment in Africa. The topic for discussion for today is emergency response, preparedness, and resilience. Hazard identification and risk evaluation play a pivotal role in the preparation of emergency response plans as well as their resilience. Therefore, this workshop will provide vital information on the importance of proper hazard identification and risk evaluations, both natural and industrial, as well as the elements to make an emergency response plan resilient. And this workshop will also help us to know the relationship between government, organizations, and communities for the improvement of emergency response plans. Today's workshop is segmented into two sessions, the morning and the afternoon sessions, and each session will last for 1 hour. But before we get started, I will like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. This workshop will be recorded and made available on Richflood YouTube channel. All participants are in listen-only mode, and kindly rename yourself and add your organizations after your name in bracket so that you can be properly identified. Full questions will be utilized throughout the webinar. We appreciate your participation. Let me also inform us that we all have the opportunity to ask questions at any time during the presentation, and our speakers will address them during the question and answer session at the end of their presentations. To do this, kindly utilize the chat box, which is located at the bottom of your screen on a computer and at the bottom of the screen for tablet device users. Please also do well to include your name and location alongside your questions and your comment. Thank you. Right now, I will introduce the speakers who will be taking us through these sessions. For this morning session, we have 3 speakers. Our first speaker is Mr. Peter Agabwe. Mr. Peter is a senior analyst at Richflood Laboratories Limited, with his several years of professional experience. He will be sharing with us vital information we need to know on hazard identification and risk assessment. It's a great pleasure to have you here on board this morning, Mr. Peter. You are welcome. The second presenter for this morning session is Mr. Ken Heap. Mr. Ken Heap is an accomplished, result-driven postgraduate health, safety, environment quality professional with his 25 years plus record of success in international oil and gas exploration and production, working with both global and local operators in staff and senior consultancy roles. He is highly experienced in the management of world-class health, safety, and environmental management system at all stages of the value chain, from licensing and planning through implementation to final remediation. Mr. Ken is a chartered environmentalist and registered lead auditor ISO 14001 and some other relevant health, safety, and environment quality standards. Thank you so much, Mr. Ken, for joining us this morning. And the third speaker for this session is Mr. Ukeme Yelo. Mr. Ukeme is a biodiversity expert with a lot of experience in the environmental sector, especially as it relates to health, safety, and environment. He will be shedding more light on the topic, emergency response, preparedness, and resilience. Also, Mr. Ukeme, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Now, we will, without wasting much of our time, we will go into the technical presentation for this morning session, and we will be starting with Mr. Peter Agabwe for his presentation. Mr. Peter, you are welcome. Over to you for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Sunday, for this opportunity. This morning this day we are looking at hazard identification and risk assessment. The objectives of this discussion is to identify the types of hazards in work area, and to make risk assessments where appropriate. Hazard identification and risk assessment methodologies varies greatly across industries, ranging from simple assessment to complex quantitative analysis with extensive documentation. Individual hazards may require that different methods be used. For example, an assessment of long-time exposure to chemicals may need to differ the method according to the equipment safety, or for assessing an office workstation. Each organization should choose approaches that are appropriate to its scope, nature, and size, and which meets needs in terms of details, complexity, time, cost, availability, or reliable data taken together. The chosen approaches should result in a comprehensive method for the ongoing evaluation of the organizational risk. Hazard assessments, according to Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, states that it involves gathering and analyzing information and observational data on meteorological, hydrological, geological, and or technical hazards. Now, why conduct a risk assessment? According to International Labour Organization, every day people die as a result of occupational accidents or work-related diseases, and more than 2.78 million deaths per year. Additionally, there are more than 374 million non-fatal work-related injuries each year, resulting in more than 4 days of absence from work, and hence the need to conduct a risk-based assessment, primarily because of the following factors. Number one, the human factor. Conducting a risk-based assessment saves lives, reduce or eliminate workplace injuries, illnesses, and then at the same time increases staff's morale. The other part is the legal factors associated with it. You conduct a risk-based assessment to meet up with legislative and occupational health and safety requirements. And also the financial factor decrease the risk of persecution and fines incurred. Reduce absenteeism, increase potential for gaining stakeholders, and increasing productivity. What are the classifications and potential sources of hazards? We have the classifications displayed with their corresponding example of hazards. The first is the mechanical classification, and the example of hazards from that may be sharp points or edge or overload. For electrical classification, it may be insulation damage or covering broken. Biological may be exposure to airborne microorganisms, and chemical may be exposure to carcinogenic chemicals. Psychologically, it may be as a result of stress or violence at a workplace. Other classification is the classification and their corresponding examples of potential hazard causatives. For instance, within the work environment, we may have hazards generated from adequacy of access within the work environment, that is to, through, and within the workplace. It may be as a result of the air conditioning system having an uncontaminated air within the workplace. And it may also be as a result of a confined space where people do not normally work, or it may be as a result of a mental stress, which may include bullying or workplace violence. And for energy, hazard may result as a result of gravity, kinetic energy, and noise. For gravity, it may be as a result of a fall, a trip, a slip of a person within its own working environment. Kinetic energy may be as a result of the body hitting an object. For acoustic, it may be as a result of exposure to short and long-term noise. And as you can see, an example within the picture displayed of the person that's of electricity potential hazards, and we can see the repercussion within the picture displayed. We have the next slide talking about risk assessments. The risk assessment is a process to determine the nature Okay, for the risk assessment process, we have 5 steps. The first step is to identify the hazards, and in identifying the hazards to avoid harm, it is critical to comprehend what is probably going to turn out badly as a result of how and why it might turn out badly. And think about the movement within the context of the physical environment and the staff who played out the action. The second step is about deciding who might be harmed. And when you have distinguished various hazards, you have to comprehend who might be harmed and how, for example, staffs working within, for instance, the laboratory or all the staffs. Always consider the workers or operators or the staffs working adjacent to the place where the potential hazard may occur. The third step is after identifying the hazards and deciding who might be harmed. After identifying the hazard and deciding who might be harmed, how you are then required to protect the people from harm. The hazards can either be removed completely or the risk controlled so that the injury is unlikely. In other words, to reduce the consequences of the risk, initially it is required to prevent access to hazards, organize the work to reduce exposure organize the work to reduce exposure, and issue protective equipment. The fourth step is about record and findings and putting them into place. Your findings should be written down. It's legal requirements. The findings should be written down. Your findings should be written down. It is a legal requirement where there are five. It's a legal requirement where there are 5 or more employees, and by the recordings and the findings, it shows that you have identified the hazard and decide who could be harmed within the process. For your qualitative risk assessments, the use of risk matrix with table scales for likelihood and severity. We can see that the likelihood aspect is all about predicting if it is very likely for the hazard to occur, if it is likely, if it is unlikely, or it is highly unlikely. And the table is displayed thus. We can see fatality and compared with the likelihood, and we can see major injuries also compared with the likelihood, and they are color-coded as high. When it is high, it is color-coded red, and that is to show that instant mitigation is required. And when it is medium, it is color-coded orange. And when it is low, it is color-coded green. So what are the actions and recommendation? The first action is to elimination, and this recommendation might require stoppage of work, or it might be in the form of substitute. Substitute that might be the use of other routes, other material, and it may be in the form of isolation. Isolation may be in the form of isolation, which might require putting up temporary barriers or the use of personal protective equipment, which are your gloves or probably your respirators. And in conclusion, risks are not always negative, and it is an opportunity to find in a better way with good outcome by taking corrective action to reduce the impact and likelihood of hazards. Thank you very much. Thank you. Over to you, Victor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Peter, for that illuminating presentation. Okay, we'll go to the second presenter for this morning session, who happens to be Mr. Ken Ip. Mr. Ken, you are welcome for your presentation. You can please go ahead with your presentation. Mr. Ken, you are welcome for your contribution. We'd like to hear from you. You are muted.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, the system wasn't allowing me to unmute. Could you just remind me how long you would like me to speak for? Hello?
All right, Mr. Ken, we'd like you to make your contributions on the topic. What would you like to share with us on this
How long
topic?
would you like me to speak for? I want to make sure I fit in with your timetable. How long?
Between 15 to 20 minutes will be okay, sir.
Okay, that's fine. Right. I'll just introduce myself. My name is Ken Heap. I've been working with the oil and gas industry internationally for the last 25 years. Prior to that, I was very much involved in education and training, and I still do a lot of education and training. I'm very pleased to say I spent 6 very happy years in Nigeria. I worked on Bonny Island with the oil terminal on Bonny Island, and I was also involved with Sea Eagle. So I've worked in Nigeria quite a lot, and I have many Nigerian friends who I keep in regular touch with. So I'm very, very happy to be able to contribute to this session. So I'd like to thank the organisers for that. What I'm going to try and do is give you a quick overview of my experience on emergency response and preparedness. If I can share my screen, I will put something up. If not, I'll just talk it through. So if I can try and share my screen now, if I can share my screen, let's see if it will do it. It should do. Yes, share screen. Let me try.
Yes,
that.
please. You are a co-host.
Yes, it's not allowing me to share my screen. If it will allow me to do that. If not, I'll just talk it through.
We are trying to make you a co-host so that I can share.
Right, okay.
In the moment we make you a co-host, and then
I'll give it 30 seconds. If it doesn't do it, I'll just talk it through.
Okay.
Try now. I'll try and share screen. Yes. So if you share screen, that's the one I want.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
I don't want to make this very complicated since we've only got 15 minutes. So what I will do is just try and link emergency preparedness to management systems, because I'm very aware that there'll be people participating in this conference from a wide range of industries. So if I can link it to management systems, the first thing is we go right back to the preface of ISO 14001, which says your management system, and therefore the element of emergency preparedness, should be appropriate in scale and complexity, both to the organization and the risks it faces. So thank you, Peter, for pointing out the importance of risk assessment in emergency preparedness, which in the traditional management system, which is easier to explain, that's the original version of ISO 14001, we have this element of emergency preparedness there. So emergency preparedness is there. What I want to stress is that the level and complexity of your emergency preparedness system must be appropriate in size and scale. I have worked for some of the largest companies in the world with very complex detailed risks, such as Shell in Nigeria. It faces some very large risks, and it manages them very well in general. I've also worked for a very small oil and gas company, still an operator in Mongolia. There were only 20 people in the company. So obviously we had to change our system to ensure it was appropriate in size and scale. So first of all, starting off the program with risk assessment is very important, because unless you have a clear risk register and you understand the kind of challenges you're going to face, you cannot even start to think about emergency preparedness. So if we go to risk assessment, it's very important. The next thing you need to do is ensure you understand your legal and other responsibilities. That is, you know which country you're working in. We can't assume everywhere is the same. And you understand who your regulator is and that you're following their requirements. So again, we can relate it back to the ISO standard And it's quite important to do that, because if you're not following the legal requirements, you could get into trouble. If you're working for a large organization, the large organization may well have its own standards and management system with which you have to fulfill. So you need to think about your legal requirements. You need to decide on your management objectives, in that what are you trying to achieve with your emergency preparedness. And in almost all cases in environmental, it will be linked to a health and safety element. And there's a hierarchy here. Let's be very clear of that hierarchy. And this is really embodied both in international law and in a moral sense. If you are managing risk, quite often we get a risk to people, then a risk to environment, then a risk to assets. We have to consider how we manage those things. And in almost all cases, we manage the risk to people first. It's usually the same team that does it, but for your information, in oil and gas, quite often, we are very, very clear in planning that the first thing we will do, regardless of anything else, is ensure that people are safe. So in our emergency preparedness, it's very difficult to separate sometimes the people side and the environmental side. But usually, in terms of precedence, we plan to manage people first, get the people safe, then you can manage the environment. Interestingly, from an accountant's point of view, that is often quite difficult to show, because the liabilities in financial terms are often much, much higher in terms of environmental damage, which is counterintuitive, but that is the case. But in almost all organizations and legislation, we always manage people first. Get your people safe, then you can move on to your environmental protection. The next thing we have to do is consider our organizational structure. And for some organizations, it's just a small team of people in one room who will manage the emergency, depending on what it is. In other organizations, we're going to have quite a significant hierarchy in terms of who manages what. We'll have people at the site of the emergency. Let's say there's a fire on an operational site, a building site. There's a fire, people might be trapped. So first of all, we've got to decide who's in charge in each of these locations. And quite often, people not used to emergency response assume that the senior manager will always be in charge. And this can be quite difficult, because you've got to consider two aspects to emergency response preparedness. The first is the crisis which is created for the organization. That is the external communications, the PR, talking to press, talking to media, who will be quite involved in all this, talking to government if it's a big organization. So who is in charge of crisis? Well, crisis, where we're talking external communication, will usually be managed by, or it makes sense to be managed by, the top people in the organization, the MD and chairman, top people. So the idea that the MD can be in charge of everything in an emergency, you've got to question that. They are in charge of crisis. And please get the words right here. Crisis is about managing the external affairs fallout from an emergency or a potential emergency. Often the crisis can start before there's any actual impact on the ground. So let's look at the other levels. When we talk about emergency response, we are talking about what you actually do in a physical sense to manage that emergency, to keep the people safe and protect the environment, and then protect the value of your assets and your reputation. So those are the 4 levels. We've got people to be safe, we've got the environment to be safe, we've got the value of your assets, and we've got the reputation of your company. And quite often the reputation of your company can be linked to how well you protect the people and the environment. It doesn't normally affect the value of your assets. So think of those things as separate. So we've got the people actually at the emergency site, and they're often called forward command. That is the person who controls the team to rescue people. The people who need to be rescued from perhaps a burning building or a collapsed structure or threat of explosion. Question, and it's called primacy. Who is in charge? We've already suggested that for primacy for crisis, the external communications to the organization, that will be the MD. When we talk about the on-site, what we call the forward command, managing the actual site of the incident, usually we appoint somebody who's been well trained in fire and rescue, or some kind, or the appropriate, if it's a tank that's about to blow up, somebody who's well trained in the asset integrity of those tanks, etc. So what we're actually doing there is managing these risks. And the person to appoint is somebody who has had training in that area, who will coordinate the team, who will have been trained on site to follow standard operating procedures for different scenarios of risk management. So primacy is very important. Be absolutely clear in your planning who is in charge on the site, and make sure that all the training puts that person in charge, and that they have developed scenarios where they've worked through, based on the risk register, the scenarios of things that could happen, and making sure that the people who are involved have any licenses and training required, competencies required. So the organizational structure should recognize that people on site may have primacy, they'll be in charge, a bit like an aircraft captain is in charge when the aircraft's flying. The owner of the airline will not interfere with the aircraft captain while the aircraft is in the air. So the person who is on site, who is managing the incident, should have been well trained, well briefed, and be working through the scenarios. They will then be supported by a group of people who will provide them with things like access to documents, things like access to plans of the site if it's a chemical site. They will start to make lists of casualties. They will start to organize extra equipment that needs to come in, but they will be at a separate site that we call it level 2, level 1 being the site where the incident's happened itself. And their job is not to control the main site. It is to support the main site. Now, quite often this cuts across the normal hierarchy of an organization. So when we're talking about the organizational structure in emergency response, we have to think it through. I don't want to labor this too much, but primacy is the thing that you must establish very, very clearly and work it through with your drills, etc. So the organization structure has to fit emergency response. Typically on site, it will be somebody who's trained in emergency response, but who also has a technical understanding of organizational rescue and will understand the plant very well, and they will control a team who've been trained appropriately to manage that site. They have primacy on the site. Think of it like an aircraft captain. They will manage the site, don't interfere too much with them. They will then ask, usually a local office, to set up a team which will manage the organization by keeping an incident room. They'll keep boards up of timelines, they'll keep a record of what's happening, That timeline is very important, not only to ensure that we know what's being done, what support's been requested, when it was requested, when it's delivered, but also in the review of the process. When we get to a review, how well did we do, we'll need to go back and see how decisions were made, what information was available at that moment. So somebody at head office or the local office needs to be doing a timeline, a scribe. Somebody will be managing that group to ensure that they are getting resources to the site as is requested by the site. They'll be getting ambulances and things like that. The site is concentrating mainly on rescue and managing the incident. That's that group. In the second level is also providing real-time information to the third level, which is the crisis group. That is the people dealing with relatives, people dealing with the press, people dealing with any external bodies such as government relations. And they're typically the top people in the organization. So the people who manage emergency response are typically middle managers and technical specialists. I hope that makes sense. So the organizational structure may be slightly different for emergency response to the normal thing. Competencies, we need to ensure that everybody who has a job to do in the emergency plan has a competence which has been tested. So we need to know what they need to be able to do, but you need managed formal exercises where those things have been tested. And one of the things I've been involved with a lot is running these simulations at different levels to make sure we understand what competence people need and we understand what competence people actually have. Communication, one of those things is to ensure you have well beforehand all the communication links you need, all the telephone numbers, email addresses, everything you need needs to be already loaded and tested, because the number of times people call a number during an exercise that doesn't work and people think of things, the only way to test this is to make sure that the communication actually works. So we need to ensure that our data is accurate and up to date through document control. So in terms of planning and implementation of emergency response, we need to be very, very clear, and we need to integrate it into our management system. But we used to use the risk register, and we also need to ensure that where the roles in emergency response give people different levels of authority in the organization, they might be different. And do remember the difference between emergency response, which is about managing the incident, and crisis, which is about managing the external things, which is often the top people. And if they're managing crisis, they cannot be involved in giving instructions on rescue. Moving on very quickly because its time is pressing, we obviously need to ensure that our system that we put in place is monitored and we keep records of all our exercises, because during the exercises we will find the times when our data is not right, telephone numbers are not right. You did say mention the role of regulators. Almost certainly, what I like to do is once we've got, and we're talking about a sizable organization here, once we've got the emergency response plan working, we're doing exercises, at appropriate times, I like to invite the regulator to come to witness the exercises and sometimes even take part in them by taking mock calls from us, etc. It really works. And obviously we need to audit that process to make sure it works. So what I'd like to say is, to sum up, I've tried to explain emergency response in terms of being appropriate to the size and complexity of the organization. A lot of what I've said can be condensed into a much simpler thing if you're a very small organization with limited risks. If you're a chemical, large organization, your risk register will give you an idea of the kind of levels you need. You do need to understand your legal requirements and that of any partners you have. And we do need then to ensure we have an organizational structure and resources which manage that. Because we have an organizational structure, we have to be clear who is in charge at the different levels. The different levels being the site itself, where the incident is taking place, a support group, who will typically be the middle managers, and this other element called crisis, which is who deals with the press, who deals with the relatives, who deals with the any fallout there is externally, external stakeholders. We need to be very clear about that, who deals with them, and that's crisis. That's crisis management, and it usually takes up the time of top management, who cannot, in practical terms, usually be involved in the actual execution of emergency response. Good emergency response means we've developed scenarios based on the risks, and we've worked out who takes what role. We know what competencies, what skills they need, what equipment they need, and we've worked through those in exercises to make sure it works. And we also need to ensure the data they have is both up to date and relevant, and we check that by doing exercises. We do monitoring and all sorts of reviews of when we've done those exercises to make sure our system works, and we formalize that in management review. I mean, have we got all the risk assessments have we identified all the risks that we need? So that's what I wanted to say. Primacy, who is in charge at each level, is very important. Do not confuse emergency response with crisis management. I think that's my 20 minutes. If anybody's got any questions, I'd be very happy to discuss that. And if at a future time you'd like to go into more detail about how to put the documentation together for this, I'd be very happy to share that with you as well.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Ken, for that noteworthy, enlightening and presentation. You have been able to tell us that the main objective of emergency response is first to keep people safe, safety first, protect the environment, and as well as protecting the asset of an organization, and of course, to help the organization to have a good reputation. Thank you, thank you. We actually received a lot of questions during your presentation, but we will take the questions after the third presenter must have finished his presentation.
Okay.
So the questions
I'll still be online. I will still be online. Okay. I hope that was useful anyway.
Yes, yes, sir. Without wasting much of our time, I will invite the third presenter, Mr. Okeme Yellow. Mr. Okeme, the floor is yours. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much for bringing me involved to also contribute to this wonderful topic. And I'll quickly run through my slide so as to see how we can meet up with the time for the presentation. And first of all, I would like to go through the background about this topic, which is on emergency response, preparedness, and resilience. And I would like to say that in recent times, countries, a lot of countries, organizations, as well as communities are faced with the challenge of instituting reforms. There's a challenge of instituting reforms, an approach to emergency management structures and framework. And this is due to the fact that planning for emergency preparedness basically involves a situation of very high probability and also comes with unique events, considering that different emergency organizations and communities are faced with different emergency situations. And also these reforms that needs to be suited to try to shift focus from responding to emergency when they are happening to trying to manage the risks that come with this emergency as they are called, and also building resilience of communities and societies and workplace, trying to keep them abreast and recover from this emergency situation as they happen. This is considered very important because we've noticed that some organizations and committees find it very difficult to come back after going through major crises, maybe if it's disaster, in terms of disaster or hazard. So emergency, as we all know, could be classified as natural or man-made, and we have them categorized in terms of such as an earthquake, we have wildfires, and even recently we're having news of flash floods, especially affecting countries in Europe like Germany. And another one that we always overlooked is issue of terrorism, which is very important for organizations to try to see how they can build this as part of their emergency preparedness. So terrorism is very important factor that organizations or communities or countries should build as part of their emergency response preparedness. And looking at the attacks of September 2021 on the World Trade Center, these are really drawn focus of nations' attention to the dangers presented by the extremes and use of terrorism in workplace and organizations. So, moving on. So this is just a brief review of the overview that I have given you, and I will discuss more extensively on the topic in the afternoon session. So let us give room for question and answer now to you so that the moderator could address some of these questions and answers because of our time. So I will come on board in the afternoon to give a detailed presentation on this. So the moderator.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Keme, for that brief presentation. We just have to take it off because of our time so that we can have quality time for question and answer. We actually receive a lot of questions, and we will see how we can take as much as possible within the limited time that we have left for this morning session. You can join us in the afternoon session for more of this. Okay, the first question that I have here is from Mr. Ifechukwu Unwiani. Mr. Ifechukwu, and the question is directed to Mr. Ken. Mr. Ken, he says, the speaker just mentioned that do not confuse emergency response with crisis management. He said, can Mr. Ken speak more on this? So Mr. Ken, Mr. Ifechukwu wants to know, he said, you mentioned that we should not confuse emergency response with crisis management. So he wants you to put more explanation on this. Mr. Ken, over to you to respond to this.
Crisis is about managing external stakeholders. And if you have a big incident in your organization, the first thing that will happen if it gets into the community is that you will have people at your door, you will have radio stations calling you, you'll have press calling you, you'll have senior ministers calling you. Now, unless you're expecting that, what can happen is your senior management gets involved in managing the emergency in the field. And that is exactly what you don't want, because what will happen is a senior minister comes on and says, I need to speak to the managing director. And the managing director is already involved in managing the crisis, in managing the emergency. So the emergency gets left. So crisis management has to be planned. You know it's going to happen. So a crisis is something that affects the organization, which is about managing the external stakeholders. How do you manage the relatives? How do you manage that crowd that gathers at the front door? How do you manage all the calls to the switchboard? So how do you manage the senior minister that calls the organization? Do you want the receptionist talking to him or her? No. You've got to expect the top management to deal with those people. If they have set up an emergency response system, which is good, middle managers who understand the plant, who understand the process very well, will have the competencies to deal effectively with managing the emergency response itself. And I have had in my career a number of, in large organizations, been asked to look at the emergency response system. And I usually find that there is a big problem in primacy. Who has responsibility for what? And I've had big discussions, I'll say, to be polite, with top managers saying, I need to be in charge. No, no, no. You do not need to be in charge of the actual emergency response, because I will guarantee that if it's a big incident, within a very short time, you'll be talking to some minister or some dealing with relatives, etc. HR and the top management should deal with crisis. And crisis is about dealing with reputation, and it's about dealing with making sure the organization can survive beyond this incident. Does that make sense? Is there a response to that?
I guess they're having some issues.
Just checking that answers the question.
I'm back, ma.
Some echo. They've been having this echo from Abuja. I hope you can hear me okay. Mr. Ken, maybe I'll need a response from you. You can hear me okay?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, so I saw the questions too. I will just quickly go into that. We have barely 2-3 minutes to go, and I'll be very fast about that. There's this question: what are the opinions of Mr. Ken on needed regulations governing emergency preparedness for nuclear reactors, most especially as African countries are considering nuclear power as a source of energy?
Clearly, the government should insist on world-class regulation, but the best way to do that is to insist on proper review of the risk assessment that's done, going back to Peter's presentation, and also that they demonstrate that they have the competencies in place by witnessing documented exercises. So the regulator gets involved in the exercises and they manage the process. Did the people hear that? That the government should obviously take primacy on this. They need to ensure that people have identified the risks, put into place people with demonstrable competencies, and the regulator needs to witness the exercises fulfill the requirements. short answer.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And the last question, I guess, because it's 11 o'clock now, is also to you, Mr. Ken, as a senior consultant on this workshop today. As a consultant, what will be your parameters to measure countries' preparedness to respond to pandemics? I guess it's similar to the question you just answered, but you can just add some flavor to it. Thank you.
It would be exactly the same as I've just said for nuclear. Point being, it's a major hazard, and therefore the government has a duty as a government to ensure organisations understand their risks. They shouldn't tell them what the risks are. The organisation has to demonstrate that they understand their risks, and then allow the government representatives to witness and take part in exercises which demonstrate competence among those with critical positions. Again, it works into the management system. Sorry to be generic.
That's very good. Yes, thank you, Mr. Ken. Unfortunately, we don't have time to elaborate more on some of these questions. And from the Abuja office, they're having this technical issue. I don't know if they're back on. But thank you very much, Mr. Ken, for your very good contributions. It's quite illuminating. And we look forward to the afternoon session. If you're back on Abuja, you can let me know so I can hand over to you to wrap up this session. But appreciations to Mr. Ken, appreciations to all of the participants that made it here today. There's no time to put some special appreciations out, but thank you very much. And we'll be doing more of this in the afternoon session. We want to have you with us. Please don't miss it. Mr. Ken will also be around, and some other consultants from the regulatory agency, regulators from the regulatory agencies will be available also in the afternoon session. So if we haven't taken your questions, apologies for that. And we'll try to see how to manage time more in the afternoon session by 3 p.m. 3 p.m. I hope I'm right, 3 p.m. Please make it a date with us by 3 p.m. We take this conversation forward. Thank you again, and bye from me. See you in the afternoon.
All right, thank you so much, we are sorry for the technical issue we had from here. All right, so we see everyone in the afternoon by 3 p.m. for the afternoon session. We also have Mr. Ken for his contribution and some other key players to make their contribution in the afternoon session. Also, we would like to inform us that we also have this workshop is a monthly, and then what we did next will be taking, or will be coming up on the 19th of August, where we're talking about the Resettlement Action Plan, RAP, Resettlement Action Plan, planning, implementation, and monitoring of the Resettlement Action Plan. All right, so till 3 p.m. in the afternoon, we thank everyone, and then until then, do have a delightful time. All right. Okay, while we are still waiting, can we all put on our camera and then we take a good photo as we try to draw the curtain for this morning session? Can we all put on our camera and take a good photo for this morning session? We'd like to see our beautiful and handsome faces.
Mr. Ojo, I think we are a bit late on this. So some of us have checked out. Maybe in the afternoon session, we can take the group photograph. I think that would be better. Some of us have checked out already. Yeah? 3 p.m. 3 p.m.